We have a special guest, Ivonne Fernandez, who's working with Cyber Solution Architect. She has over a decade of experience in IT security, specializing in secure solutions across various domains. She focuses on AWS services and is dedicated to solving complex security challenges while staying current with industry trends. Could y'all please give her a round of applause?
Thank you. My presentation has a lot of diagrams, and I'm not sure if you will be able to see them in the back. So I'll really encourage you to move to the front. And the presentation, I'm going to publish that at the end, probably of this week, in my LinkedIn profile, so feel free to download it. I'm glad you're here, and thank you for letting me talk today. We will be talking about Zero Trust as a strategy. I'm trying to bring a couple of samples from the architectural standpoint of how that can be applied. And I'll tell you why I selected CISA as the Zero Trust model to do my presentation. I'll encourage you to do questions at the end. I'm planning to have probably 35 minutes of my section, so I can leave like 10 minutes for questions at the end. And how many of you have built a strategy before? Great. The reason why I put this slide here is because it's very important to understand what are the security roles and responsibilities as part of our strategy. And I, on purpose, highlight the security architect role because what I'm presenting today is from the lens of an architect. Zero Trust will mean different things based on the role that you are. But today, my presentation is from the lens of an architect. So this is me in 2000 dealing with simple security. Back those days, we only worry about viruses. So we have a simple antivirus. We were securing firewalls. We deal with PCs, few laptops. Remote access was limited. It was simple, right? And intrusion detection system was something that it was starting evolving. Back in those days, internet was also coming out. However, this is what we are dealing today. The environment is more complex because we have people working from everywhere that wants to access data anywhere, but we are also dealing with hundreds of SaaS applications. And probably, how many of you have the 3 cloud providers, AWS, Azure, and GCP in your environments? Right? So, to make things more complicated. Before I continue, I want to show you this report. This report was put out by Cloud Security Alliance in 2022, and it's talking about the 11 threats that we see in cloud computing. If you notice, and I'm sorry, this is too small, that's what I'm saying, that if you guys can move to the front, but the first 4 are basically weak identity and access management, weak APIs, misconfigurations, and then a lack of cloud strategy. Last month, they published this report again, and now misconfiguration is top 1, but they haven't changed a lot. What this report is telling us is that who is responsible in this case? Do you think that is a cloud provider or is us? Us. This is our responsibility. And I predicted that misconfiguration was number 1. And sure enough, that's what it comes with this report last month. It's hard because we have, if you look at AWS, they have more than 230 services, right? Do we know all of them? Do we know how to configure that? The answer is no. Even inside of AWS, these people have their specialties. You have database specialists, you have identity and access management specialists. Oh, by the way, that report is very good in terms of telling you all the cases that they analyze, and also is giving you the threat modeling points and the cloud matrix for access control. So I really encourage you to read that report. It's really good. Now, before you start strategy, you need to understand what is the motivation of your company to move to zero trust before you start your zero trust journey. You always have limitations in terms of resources and money. You need to focus on what are the drivers. So I put here a couple of them. For the company that I currently work, they want to go to be IPO. And they mean that a lot of compliance and regulations are coming up. So this is the reason why they want to go, right? So understanding all these challenges is important before you start this journey. Now, there are different kind of definition for zero trust model. And I only mentioned here 4. So NIST 800-207 is a framework that is very generic that can be used across all industries. We have the DoD, Department of Defense, which is basically used a lot in the US, especially for the Defense Department. But you'll find that some other companies like that framework as well. National Security Agency. However, I'll be focusing on CISA, which is the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. And you'll see why in a minute. So let's start with understanding what is zero trust. Zero trust is basically a model. It's a strategy. It helps define the next generation of capabilities you want to enable in your architecture. A lot of vendors will tell you, oh, buy my product and you're zero trust. No, zero trust is not a technology. To understand zero trust, we need to go back to these tenets. And when we talk about strategy, they are going to be important. So when we started talking about assume breach, if you as an architect start helping your organization architecting things from that point of view, understanding that it's just time, one day will be breached. Your mind will change in the way we do things. And I have an example later to show you how you could do that. Then the other is never trust, always verify. Believe it or not, we say, oh, yeah, we don't have to be worried about insiders in our organizations. You never know. So you have to treat outsiders and insider threats as 50-50%, and in this case, equally. And then when we talk about least privilege, this is a very fun one because, especially in AWS, how many of you are seeing identity and access management on AWS, and how many of you consider that in your organizations, the permissions that all these developers have is least privilege? Just raise your hand. What I have seen most of the time is, oh yeah, he needs that permission, but because he needs to access that and I couldn't figure out permissions, let this person admin role. So over provisioning and over permissions is kind of common. Okay, so let's go back to CISA Zero Trust. CISA Zero Trust is based on NSA. Oh, they got the best of the pillars from NSA and DoD. And this is the reason why I choose this model for my presentation. So we have 5 pillars. We have identity, we have devices, we have network, applications, and data. These are the 5 things that we need to work on. Which one do you think that is the most important one, in your opinion? Identity will be one, but what is the reason why we want to put really good identity? What are we trying to protect? The data. So understanding data is also important. You can't say, oh, I'm going to protect everything. You need to think about what data is that you really want to protect, because you don't want to design controls around data that doesn't matter for the business, right? Okay, all these 5 pillars have 3 foundations that we need to have. We need to have visibility, meaning do we have logs and a way to analyze those logs? And we'll talk about that in the presentation. You have to start thinking about automation and orchestration. What that really means is, can we detect and respond and remediate from automation standpoint, right? And the last one is governance and compliance. If you look at the DoD framework, they don't have governance and compliance. So this is why I choose this one. In my opinion, it's the one that has like more complete picture of what we need to have in our architectures. Okay, let's talk about strategy. Here we have CISA Zero Trust Maturity Model, and use this for 2 things. You have different levels in your organization across identity and all the pillars. If you are building a strategy, first of all, you need to understand what is your current state. So if you go against this and I say, well, yeah, we use passwords and we have simple MFA. What am I, right? The next step will be, where do I want to go? What's the future state? Oh, yeah, we want to go to be the optimal. Well, what that really means. So this maturity model will help you create your roadmap in terms of where you are, where do you want to be, and that will help you with your gap analysis, right? What are the things that we need to work on? DoD Zero Trust capabilities, and I apologize for this being small, but as I said, you'll have all the links where you could go and grab all this information that I put together. They also have their levels. So you could either use CISA or DoD, or you can use a combination of both to help you determine where are you, what is your current state, and where do you want to go. Here is, we're doing your gap analysis, and this is what I was talking about. If we assume breach when we are architecting things, which for me, this is an exercise that I did for a company. They have credit card data everywhere. When I ask the owner, oh, well, yeah, we need that for analysis. I'll say, okay, let me ask you questions. What happens if you get breached? What is your fine for each credit card that you're saving? So after doing that exercise, assume a breach. This is what we came with. We say, okay, let's limit the amount of credit card data. We're just going to hold it for the period of time that the customer is doing transactions with us. Once the customer finished, we'll delete it. 2, let's implement tokenization. So we are not responsible for, from the PCI standpoint compliance, the payment processor will do all the PCI compliance. We just have to be worried about those tokens, right? But what happens if those tokens are stolen? What do you think? In my opinion, nothing, because at least they have a way to go and translate those tokens to real credit card data. Then I'll have to be worried. And because they were recording all the calls and the users were putting, the consultants were putting that information, we wanted to stop recording. And then we decided that all the data will be encrypted before that data is outloaded to the S3 buckets. So see how your mind changed after you start thinking, we're going to be breached no matter what? You start thinking and designing in a different way. But let's talk about the first pillar, which is Zero Trust, is identity pillar, which I agree with you. Identity is one of the most important things, because if you look at from the data breaches perspective, this is where we're getting a lot of track, right? And it's changing. In the past, we were talking about only users. Now we're talking about all these services that are non-human that we also have to secure. And believe it or not, secret management is one of the hardest because we don't have control over. Okay, so this is, bear with me, this is the Zero Trust reference architecture in terms of AWS. But if you notice, at the bottom you have governance, risk, and compliance. We saw that in CSAT, right? At the top, we have orchestration, which is basically your CI/CD pipeline. On the right, we have observability. We're going to be looking at what things you should be logging and looking at. So when we start about talking about identity, we are talking about AWS accounts, and we are talking about identity and AWS identity and access management. But from the perspective of governments, you still have to do AWS account management and managing that access. In some of those cases that are outside, in blue, you might need to use tools, third-party vendor tools to help you with that. So let's start with the perspective of accounts. Go to a multi-account strategy. And the reason why you want to do this is because you want to limit the blast radius. How many of you have seen your company having Dev and Pro mixed in the same account? Okay, don't tell me, but I have seen it a lot. So the idea is that when you start crafting your strategy, create multiple accounts for different reasons, and keep your prod and your dev environment separately for your applications, in part because you want to eliminate the blast radius. If one of your accounts get compromised, doesn't compromise the rest. And so, moving to that, do you want to select one of those accounts to be the managing account? Because the next thing that you want to do is use AWS organizations to start organizing those accounts in organizational units. And you might want to use Control Tower to help you from the standpoint, I will see it in a minute, from the standpoint of provisioning accounts in a automated way, what we call the vending machine. So the beauty of having those organizational units is that now I can put something called service control policies. These are my guide rails that I can put on AWS to start determining what can be done and cannot be done in those accounts. Here's an example. If my environment is fully controlled, I want to put service control policies of what services can be available. Do I want, for instance, to use Cassandra? Maybe not, because the company hasn't approved that database yet. So that's one example. Another example could be, I don't want anybody to spin accounts in a different region. I want to put that control policy and say, only these 2 regions are allowed to spin resources. Sometimes I have done it by accident, spinning something and I didn't realize that it's in Ohio, right? But sometimes even for compliance, you don't want anything outside of US. All right, so talking about Control Tower, notice the concept of vending machine. In this architecture, you're still leveraging AWS organizations. You probably want to leverage AWS CloudFormation to programmatically control the creation of accounts in a systematic manner with all the governance in place and compliance that you want in those accounts. Not necessarily you could use AWS CloudFormation. I've seen companies using Terraform or what's the other one? Pulumi. Okay. This is what I was talking about. Here's an example of a service control policy where I could say, hey, don't allow this someone to stop an EC2 instance if they don't have, for instance, MFA enabled. You can be very creative with the kind of service control policies that you want to put in place. In long term, you want to move from long-term credentials to shorter credentials, and this is what I mean. In the past, we used to have 3 or 4 accounts, and you probably start using Identity and Access Management and create local accounts for users, and probably start using cross accounts roles so people can assume one role from the other. You don't have visibility over this. And imagine if you have 200 accounts. That will be a nightmare to manage. So what we would like to do is to move to a federated way to do this. So use Identity Center. Now you have your accounts, you have your organizational units. Now you use Identity Center to create users and create those groups and determine what kind of roles those groups can assume. So you are using this from the central standpoint. Now, in terms of real life in your companies, from Identity and Access Management, you may have other tools, right? You may have SailPoint to do Identity and Access Management life cycles. So this is a tool that might be connected with your HR system and detect when a new user is on board. And you will use this tool probably to do role-based access certifications. Hey, you're a manager. Every 3 months, because you are handling a PHI system, you need to certify that these users still need permissions in there. And so then we have an authentication management tool. Could be Okta, which the role will be authenticating those users in an SSO manner and will handle all the MFA portion, because we want an advanced MFA. And then you might have to have a tool for PAM to manage all the privileged access management, maybe something like Beyond Trust. Oh, by the way, I'm not selling any of this. This is just to give you an example from the Identity and Access Management perspective of what you should be having. Again, depends also on your organizations. If you're small, you don't need all this, right? Okay, I use Okta for the sample, as I said. I'm not selling that, but just for the example of showing how you can have your HR system connecting to Okta, and you still have domain controllers. You may want Okta to have all the groups, or those groups are coming from Active Directory. It depends on how you architect things, but those are being synchronized through SAML and Scheme over AWS, so you can have a centralized identity and access management. Here is, remember what I was telling you, that we want to move from long-term credentials to shorter credentials? Here's an idea of something that I'm working on right now. And this is, I want the developers to connect to AWS using my SSO, obtain a token, and from that token, they can connect to the database. Is that long-term or short-term credentials? Short-term. The beauty of this is that they are not only authenticating against AWS, they are authenticating against Okta. And also because I'm using multi-factor authentication, and even, how many of you know YubiKeys? So if you have YubiKeys, which is a hardware kind of passkey, but it's a physical hardware connected to the PC, that can give me some certain that that user that is connecting is the user that it is. So this is where any of these tools can help you put more controls to improve the security. Anyway, the other concept that we are moving into is just-in-time least privileged access. So I picked up Okta in this example, but I believe CyberArk will work in the same thing. The idea here is that production environments should be locked, right? If I need to do something in prod, I should be requesting that access, and that access should be given to me temporarily, maybe for an hour or 2 or 3, I don't know. Depends on what I'm going to do there. And once I'm done, I don't have access to that anymore. And I put the link in there because this is one of the case studies that AWS is publishing. But just to give you an idea. Now, AWS doesn't have anything about device pillar. Here's where you, if you're going to be working on endpoint protection and mobile device management, you will need to look for tools outside of AWS. There is not really a lot for that. Now let's talk about the network. When we start talking about network, here is something important to understand. In AWS, there are three kinds of applications that you can build. You can build applications based on VPCs. In that case, your responsibility is to secure your virtual machines, your VPCs, your security groups, all the resources, plus the APIs. Because believe it or not, and we're going to talk about this, everything on AWS or any cloud provider can be accessed by an API. And the second case is serverless. You might have applications that are using Lambda functions where everything is serverless. In that specific case, my responsibility is API and misconfiguration. Make sure that those services are not misconfigured. All right. And the third kind is where you have the mix of both. In that case, apply both cases. You have to secure everything. Now, when we start talking about network, we are talking about VPCs. Imagine that a VPC is your virtual data center, right? Where you still have to define your routes, you still have to define your subnets, you still have to define how things are going to be connected. Is that subnet going to be public or is going to be private? And the idea is that, okay, you have one AWS account. Try to have one VPC for account. I think it's a mistake right here. It's a VPC per application because you could have multiple VPCs inside of your account. I need to fix that. The idea here is that you start having a subnet for resource. So here, look, I have a private subnet for my load balancer. I have a private subnet for my EC2 instance, and I have a private subnet for my database. Why? Because, oops, did I go? No, it's fine. The next thing that I need to do is have security groups. So I'll put security groups per resources, and I can limit what can connect with what using those security groups. In this case, I don't want the load balancer to talk to my database directly. So when you start segmenting this using subnets and security groups, it gives you that granularity. Knuckles is a concept where you basically are putting a kind of firewall, but you're doing it at the subnet level. Security groups are done at the resource level. Understanding the difference is important too. Most of the time, you see companies using security groups because if I open a port, outbound port, the traffic that is leaving out is able to come back. That doesn't happen with Knuckles. So you need to understand the difference between both of them. In a very high control environments, you use both, right? But you still have to be careful when you design those. Now, we are talking about VPCs. And we are saying, hey, the idea is that you have VPC per application. So here is an example. I have a remote working environment. One VPC has my domain controllers, another VPC has my workspaces, right? So it's still tried to separate that. But how they communicate? Basically with VPC peering. Then you say, wait a minute, what if I have 200 VPCs? That will be like a nightmare trying to control who can talk to what. So here is, when you have more complicated environments, you want to use AWS Transit Gateway. And what is Transit Gateway is managing all those routes. Who can talk to what? You have it in a more centralized way. Again, you have to be careful. Because if this is mal-configured, then you are allowed traffic to go places where it shouldn't be, right? But you have that choice. This is a very important concept that I didn't know. Did you know what happened when you request the access to an S3 bucket? You are charged, true, but that's going out to the internet. That traffic is traversing the internet to come back to AWS. Do we want that? No. What we want is to use a VPC endpoint where I say, wait a minute, I need to talk to my S3 buckets, but I want the traffic to be local. I don't want to go out and come back. So you should be using VPC endpoints for S3 buckets, database, anything that is serverless. S3 buckets, databases, SQS, SNS. So here is an example of an application that needs to talk to microservices, and I'm using a VPC endpoint, but notice that at the other end, I need to use an AWS API gateway endpoint. So for VPC endpoint, I need an endpoint that it will support that on the other end. Private link is kind of a VPC endpoint, but this is for other services that doesn't support or doesn't have that VPC endpoint. Here's for, in this example, we have a load balancer. But here I'm controlling where the traffic is going, and I keep it private. All right, let's talk about application security, application and workloads. And is this moving? OK. The reference architecture now started being more complex because from the DevOps standpoint, and this is where I did an enhancement, we need to be sure that we embed security when we are doing the CI/CD pipeline. And that is not happening in most cases today. We want to scan before we deploy, and if things go wrong, they need to go back. I see a lot of companies, even the company I work for, struggling still in this. They do it after, right? And manually, you probably do static scans, you probably do a lot of the stuff before they deploy. But the idea is to be part of it. The idea is to integrate all that security in place. OK, when we talk about application security, I want to create this awareness. Everything in the cloud is API reachable. So how can I access that? Most of the time, we see the console, AWS console. But that's not the only way. I can access that using SDKs. So for that specific case, I need a key and a client secret for that API key, right? Do we have visibility? We need to have visibility on where are those keys created and how these keys, secret keys, are being stored. And what kind of privileges? Because based on how you create and the roles of those keys, you could do a lot of stuff. And then that can be through SDKs. Or in the worst cases scenario, I can do this with Postman. I don't have to be an expert if I can find APIs that I can play with that are not secure enough. So from the perspective of you as a security architect or architect in general, it's important to have reference architectures for your people. I just put this one in here because this is a typical API application, and it's serverless. But that doesn't necessarily mean that this is the only you want. You want to go back to your environment, understand how they are building those applications. Are they using microservices? And try to understand all the components and see what kind of security you need to put in place. For instance, secret manager. This is one of the things that I have seen in organizations that is a nightmare. Where are they keeping secrets and how those secrets are being accessed? Who has access to those secrets? Are they being rotated? Are they encrypted, right? So in this specific sample, if you are building APIs, you would like to have one point of entry. And that point of entry might be managed by API gateway. It necessarily means that you have to have a AWS API gateway. There are many other vendors. Based on the architecture that you're analyzing, you want to make sure that the access point is just one, and from there, you are protecting those APIs behind it. And the other awareness that I want to create, if you go online and look for the OWASP top 10, there are 4 APIs as well, OK? And from the observability standpoint, you need to make sure that you may have this cloud trail to log on all your API access. and you want to have, we'll talk about CloudWatch later, but you want to make sure that these services are in each account so you'll have visibility. Of course, that costs money. I can hear that, yeah. From the application authentication standpoint, this is something that I see that is kind of complex, understanding how your organization is building these applications that have customer facing, where you are managing the customer identity and access management. And here, the proliferation of OpenID and open authorization protocol is really high, but do everybody really understand what are the best practices to architect these kind of applications? There's one of the things that is really hard. Like when we talk about users authenticating, what kind of applications are native, are mobile, are web? And based on those applications, there are standards of how that exchange of tokens should be happening. And sometimes you'll find that they are not using the best practices. And again, when you call your APIs, you should be passing what they call an access token. And there is also best practice of what information should be traveled on those tokens, because these tokens are public, meaning I can install them anytime. One of the misconfigurations that I see a lot is that an ID token and access token, sometimes they have too much sensitive information, PII information. So this is something that you can inspect in your applications. But that's a whole world. OpenID and OAuth protocols, they are big in their own. This is another architecture where you can use Auth0, or you can use AWS Cognito, whatever identity provider you want for your customer application. Again, it is another way to do it, but at the end, all of them are using IDPs for authenticating your customers. You need to understand how this is done. From the data perspective, we are talking about certificates, key management. We have been talking about encryption. I don't think that this has changed. So this is how the whole picture of your architecture looks like. And again, I'll share this with you, but we should be doing vulnerability management. We need to be doing application management from the observability standpoint. We need to be able to monitor infrastructure. We be able to have event logging. And we're going to start talking about, I know you know, to protect data in transit and rest. So I want to spend a lot of time here. But here is where you want to start thinking about how you are going to connect, have logs in all the accounts, and how those logs should go to an account that is read-only, because you really don't want your adversary or to go and delete those logs. And from there, you need to figure out how to connect them or send them to your event manager. I put some more logic in here, but that doesn't necessarily means that this is. Just understand whatever tool your company is using, how you can connect that to your AWS accounts. When we start talking about detect and response, we would like to move to this. We wanted to do automation as much as we can. So in this specific case, we got an EC2 instance that's compromised, and because I have VPC flow logs enabled, and I have AWS CloudTrail, and I have my Amazon guard duty detecting that something is wrong, I can create an automation process with Amazon Bridge to indicate a Lambda function that something needs to be there, and go and hit and change the security group, for instance, in this case, so I can isolate that EC2 instance. So this is just an example of how can you start doing that automation. One more thing, this is something that I think I found very useful, is that you can still mirroring. You have VPC mirroring, where you can start capturing those logs, capturing the traffic. So if you like to play with Wireshark, I think this is something that is very useful. And that's it for me. I think we can open it to questions.